Today on the show, we have a very special guest, Dr. Leslie Sherlin, who I'm going to introduce in just a minute. But first, he's going to tell us why we should tune into the show today.
Yeah, and that's such a tough question, quite honestly. I've been thinking about it for a little bit of trying to decide how do we be modest, but also be transparent and not knowing where the conversation is going to go. So I'm just going to jump in and say that the things that I hope that we dig into are how our brain states, specifically from an electrical standpoint, contribute to our overall experience, and then what we individuals can do to modulate that to help create the experience of life that we're ultimately hoping for. So that's kind of I think the value proposition here is learning how to have insight into how we think, feel, and behave, and how to modulate that in some way.
This is the Roscoe's Wetsuit Neuro Podcast, the neurohacking show where we teach you how to optimize your cognition. Keep up to date at roscoeswetsuitneuro.com. Now here's your host, Toby Passman.
All right, welcome everyone to a new episode of the Roscoe's Wetsuit Neuro Podcast. If you guys are a fan of the show, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We would really appreciate that. And if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for guests that you want to see on the show, feel free to shoot me a DM at Roscoe's Wetsuit Neuro on Instagram. You could also email me, roscoeswetsuitpodcast@gmail.com. To give you guys a bit more background, Dr. Sherlin is a licensed associate counselor and sport and performance psychology consultant to dozens of athletes, teams, and individuals. Dr. Sherlin has had an extensive career in providing patient services, academic research and instruction, and entrepreneurial endeavors in mental health care. He is one of the world's leading experts and a leader in the research and use of neuroscience for improving human performance. He's led research partnerships with Red Bull North America's High Performance Center, USA Track and Field, U.S. Military Special Operation Forces, local and federal law enforcement agencies, Fortune 500 companies, and professional teams in multiple sports in many countries. He's published his work in the academic literature and has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, BBC, Sports Illustrated, CNN, ESPN, CBS, Popular Science, Outdoor Magazine, and more. So, Dr. Sherlin, I could continue, but welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks. Let's not continue. Let's have some real conversation.
Yes, absolutely. So I'll just tell you, as far as how I first got familiar with or first heard about your work, was reading one of my favorite books of all time, honestly, The Rise of Superman by
Okay.
Stephen Kotler. And there's a variety of different I guess pieces of an interview that he used in that book. How did he reach out to you to interview you for that book, or how did that collaboration kind of come about?
Yeah, actually, we met at an event that Red Bull North America was hosting, and it was called Glimpses. And there was this really great consortium of individuals, and it was really an elite group of movers and shakers, so to speak, in the field of performance. And he happened to be at that conference. And then I was fortunate enough to be one of the presenters. So I gave it like a little brief. It was almost like in the TED kind of style of, quick talk. So we did that. And then we met afterwards. Somebody made an intro and hit it off. And then we just kind of started developing a relationship of exploring the things he was interested in, particularly as it related to the brain component of performance. And so, yeah. And so then as he started that work, he said, I want to pick your brain a little bit about some of these things. And then we had some really good conversations. Interestingly, it's actually kind of ironic that one of the most prominent flow states that I've ever experienced while not doing something that's like in a sporting kind of world was actually in that phone call with Steven. It was really kind of a cool moment of like all of those kind of elements transcending time and getting into really deep kinds of things. It was really fun. So yeah, that's kind of how it played out.
Interesting. So
Mm-hmm.
just a cool connection, and produced the flow state with one of the guys on
Right.
experts in flow states, right?
Yeah,
Right
exactly.
on. So let's back up a little bit and just kind of tell me, how did you originally kind of just get into the field of psychology and your particular expertise? Like, how did that come about?
Yeah, it's to me, I started to say it's an interesting story, but it's an interesting story to me because none of it was planned that way. It wasn't that at any point in my history I said, "Oh, this is what I want to do when I grow up." In fact, I had originally began college, and I'll kind of skip all the stuff that contributed before that. But as I was in college, I was studying music, and there was a thing that was interesting to me where I was really good, but I wasn't the absolute best. And I would work really hard and see some of my peers not work as hard, but they would excel beyond what I was doing. So there was always this kind of feeling of like, man, I have to work harder to get to the same place as somebody who's more. And at the time, I attributed to they were just more talented. They were better for whatever reason, and it almost doesn't matter why they were better, but there was this difference, this thing that happens. Like if we look the same, have similar backgrounds, cultural implications, access, resources, et cetera, we should be pretty comparable, but that wasn't the case. And so I moved away from music for a variety of reasons, and then started on this different search of various majors. And then finally, somewhere around my 8th year of being an undergraduate, my advisor said, "Hey, look, you don't have to go away. We just call it graduate school. So pick something." And I'd been interested in psychology from a lot of different angles, but said, well, let's give that a go. Let's try that. And just by coincidence, I happened to grow up in Tennessee, and I had been given a music scholarship to go to the University of Tennessee. So that's where I stayed. And then in my actual senior year, I had a choice of senior capstone class. It was either idiot savants or biological basis of behavior. When I was really young, I thought about being a physician, and so I thought, oh, let's do that biological basis of behavior. And then the professor was Dr Lubar, who was actually a guest on one of your previous shows.
Yes.
So that's just, serendipity of landing in that class with him as the professor was really a catalyst that was one of those, forks in the road, so to speak, that changed the trajectory of what my life turned out to be. So I stuck around there, stayed and worked in Dr. Lubar's laboratory for several years while pursuing degrees in clinical psych. And then, so it was just kind of a real serendipitous moment. And then that has followed me, like that notion of going with what life gives to you rather than banging on the door that you want to get inside of, but instead going, well, I'm having a hard time opening this door. And you look slightly to your left and there's another door that's wide open. It's like, well, let me just walk through that one and see what happens. That really is the story of my career path. It was that. And then that being a student of Dr. Lubar's really opened a lot of opportunities. There was some immediate credibility that was established, and it was a good program. He's a great professor, and that the program was good. So then, as I moved out into the world, was working in a private practice for another individual, working in electrophysiology, neurofeedback, quantitative EEG, both in research as well as clinical practice. That then opened some other opportunities, and was out doing my own thing, predominantly doing research and analysis for other professionals. And happened to be, again, come in contact with a group of individuals who are in the entrepreneurial space, and they wanted some domain expertise in that. Then that opened a door that then introduced me to some really great people at Red Bull, people who were collaborating with Red Bull, and then most notable of those, another became good friend, and then an influencer, Michael Gervais, who is one of the preeminent sports psychologists in the world, really, but especially has a big hold here in the US. And so that then opened up the sports psych world. So then combining all these things, and then from there, it's just like a whole domino effect of, knowing people, meeting people, and that opening new doors. So that's kind of how it's a really fun to think about, because none of that could have been planned that way. And if I had been on this really rigid planned path, I'm not sure any of it would have happened.
Right, right. I talk to people a lot about that same thing right there. Um,
Mhm.
in terms of what when you look back at your time kind of learning from Dr. Lubar and working at his research lab, like what were some of the things that stood out to you the most?
Um, well, there's so many things. I would say there were a couple of pivotal kind of components. Again, the people who were in the lab, besides him, just that group of individuals who were there, had both direct and indirect influences. One of which, we're still friends. There was an Italian student who had come over named Marco Congedo, who's still really pioneering and forging forward in brain computer interface work. He's based in France. He had ran upon this particular analysis, which is called low resolution electromagnetic brain tomography, or LORETA. And it was a really lengthy process to do analysis. And he had arranged to go to Switzerland and study with and learn about how to do it, because he was bugging the developer. He was a very curious guy, and he wanted to use this and was bugging him. And finally, Roberto Pascal Marquis, the creator of that, said, look, I'm happy to teach you this stuff, but you're going to have to come over here. You're not going to be bugging me on this email, all day long, every day. So when Marco said he would go, we had become friends. And I was like, I want to go. So I wrote on his coattails, and then together we came back. And, having that knowledge, I was really doing a lot of just the, kind of the data lackey kind of work in the lab, because I was the youngest, least experienced in that group of individuals who were studying at the time. And so we created basically a software platform that would do this LORETA analysis in a much more efficient way, because it was very time consuming to do. And then that launched a whole, lots of things. We were able to start a company. We started selling the software. And then that made intros to new people, and got into different doors and different applications. So that was really a pivotal moment of having the support from Dr. Lubar to implement that type of newer, analytics into the lab, but then also the doors that Roberto and Marco opened up, and getting to participate alongside them in that research.
And what was kind of the beginning of you sort of realizing the importance of like understanding the electrical activity of people's brains when it comes to, high performance?
It didn't occur to me about performance just yet. So that had been, that foundation was kind of under there. But for me, what the initial draw, which was, like, one, it's a non-invasive, relatively inexpensive way for us to see how is the brain contributing to that person's experience. So in the beginning, I was mostly interested in trying to understand both clinical pathologies, but just new differences. I mean, I was, doing really basic research of, what happens, how does a person react or respond when, being in a room that's filled, colored with, their preference of colors, or, sounds, or being in an environment that was more conducive to a particular type of state of learning or agitation, those kinds of things. So just trying to understand, one, what does it look like from a brain standpoint if a person has a certain clinical presentation or symptom presentation? What does it look like if they're doing a particular task versus a resting state? So it was less about performance and more just about how does this thing work? And then what was really exciting about it was the capacity of implementing operant conditioning of the EEG, or now called neurofeedback, to say, like, if you don't want that set of experiences, whether it's clinical or not, you can learn to shift it. And so that was a really fascinating idea. So I think there were a couple of pieces. One, there was a way for us, an individual, to purposefully or intentionally control the brain state and our experience. That's really exciting, because it empowers the individual rather than, taking a medicine or being in the hands of somebody else to take care of us in some way. So that was exciting. And then, obviously the cost effectiveness of an EEG is, and non-invasive nature. It's one of the few tools in neuroimaging that, you can, a researcher or even a student researcher can do on a budget. So that was the initial piece. But then as we started getting exposed to more high performing individuals, elite athletes, executives, those kinds of individuals, is like, well, it had been pondered. It wasn't like it was a novel idea, but it hadn't been really thoroughly investigated when we first started exploring that, which was like 2008, 2009. There was, the research was really sparse, almost non-existent. And so it was like, well, if we know that if I can work with an individual who has clinical symptoms and bring them from here to here, what about individuals who are already here? They're healthy, functioning, they maybe have life challenges or maybe even symptoms, but we're really aiming, instead of removing symptoms, adding performance, whatever that means in their particular world. Like, we don't know what the cap on potential is. Like, we would still unknown. So it's not like we can say, oh well, you've tapped out, you're at the top of your game, don't bother. We don't know. So that was really exciting to start to say, all right, we know the brain states are different. How does that fit for this group of individuals? And so then we just sat out on a path of exploring, like, one, are elite performers' brains different? The answer was yes. Within that population, are there nuances or differences? So can we start to identify, people who would be better suited for some, either positions or types of environments than others? The answer was yes. Will they respond to training? Like, can they change their brain? And yes. And then ultimately, do those changes impact performance related outcomes, not just their own subjective experience of their internal environment? And then the answer was yes. So it opened up a whole new set of same questions we were asking in the clinical world before, but just applied now on the performance side, which all of us to some degree are performers, whether we're being a parent or being a worker or whatever our thing is, we have to perform. And so that really, in my mind, was powerful to broaden the range. So now, make the joke all the time. People say, who's it good for? Like, anybody who's got a brain. Like, literally, self-regulation can be a powerful thing for all of us.
Right, right. I mean, you think about, like, if someone was to ask that question of, who should go to the gym, who should work out,
Right.
it's like, you wouldn't just say, oh, someone who doesn't have any muscles. Like, it could be good for that person to build muscle. It could also be good for a
Yep.
person who's already in good shape to get in even better shape. So I
Exactly.
like the same approach when it comes to brain training there.
Hmm.
What were some of the main findings when you were examining that question of the differences of peak performers' brains? Like, what were you finding in the electrical activity of peak performers that differed from a normal population?
Yeah, so I think there's probably a few key things that stand out, and it's less like one might expect me to say something like, oh, they had this particular EEG phenomena that shows up that doesn't show up in healthy individuals or symptomatic individuals. But it's not that. In fact, I would say that if you were to take any individual's, EEG and we were to analyze it, that information alone wouldn't necessarily differentiate or have us, be able to discriminate. Yes, this person is a high performer. This person has a clinical presentation. This person doesn't. What we see are anomalies in the EEG, but it's about how does the individual manage those anomalies. So in some cases, there might be a finding that in one individual causes no, they're just, it's just not a non-event. In other individuals, it might severely cripple them from a symptom presentation. And in another individual, it somehow causes them to be able to excel in a particular way. So the biggest difference in the high performers takeaway is that their brain is unique in the way that they manage the things that they have. So in one person, it might be anxiety. In another individual, it's motivation, drive, determination, perseverance. It's that same internal push that causes one person to experience that as a negative thing and the other person to say, this is who I am. They don't perceive it as a negative thing, not because they're special, unique, different, better than, just because they don't have that experience. And instead, that's the perseverance of like pushing themselves to new limits and really wanting to refine their craft. So that's the biggest thing, is that their brains are very much not necessarily more powerful or less powerful in any particular or specific way, but the things that they have, they really use in a unique way. So that would be one piece. And the other that really stands out is the flexibility for them to switch tasks. So create, I always say, like, there's basically, in my model of performance with regard to brain training, is there's four basic steps. One is to create different brain states. So if I don't know what it feels like to focus or concentrate, I'm not going to be able to do it. So like, I have to know, my brain has to have the capacity to do that thing. If it's calm or reduce, like manage myself under pressure, My brain has to know what to do with that information. And this applies across various different states. So we have to be able to create those brain states. And then from there, we want to volitionally control it, being able to like me decide, okay, right now the stakes are, the pressure is high. I need to kind of be able to dial that down, that internal anticipation or whatever, pressure response, dial it down. And then the third piece would be flexibility. Can I shift between high intensity, calm, idle, now re-engage at a lower level, like having that real flexibility? That's where elite performers really stand out, is that capacity to, instead of having an on and off switch, I often say, well, they have a dimmer switch. So I can be put in any environment if I were a high performer and dial it up or down to match my environment. And that's the real difference where they excel. Because they, imagining just the most basic way to think about it is, if we have a scale of under arousal on one side and over arousal on the other, lots of times people get stuck in one end or one place. And that's why we tend to experience a clinical presentation as we go, I feel this thing, but it's only a problem at home, or it's only a problem at school, or it's only a problem at work. It's because there's no flexibility in being able to do that. It might help us excel in one environment, but be detrimental in another. The elite performers have the capacity to kind of move along that continuum to make their internal environment match the external environment, or adjust and adapt to it. So that's the biggest two things.
And is that flexibility something that we can increase in terms of training both the brains of peak performers along with just a clinical population?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's one of the, again, when people, whether they come into my practice for clinical presentation or sport or performance, whatever that looks like, that is one of the pieces, like saying, okay, let's first create the brain state. Let's identify, maybe there is some anomaly that's occurring that's contributing to their experience. Okay, let's address that. But then let's kind of work both in and out of that state. The analogy I like to use a lot is, if I say, if we're just sitting here, let's say relax your arm, you're like, my arm is relaxed. It's just, sitting here on this desk and it's not activated. Those muscles aren't activated. It's relaxed. But there's like almost like a neutral state. If I hold a barbell or tense up my arm for 30 seconds and then I say relax, it feels drastically different. It really pushes those edges of that continuum. So we'll do that in a session. I'm like, okay, maybe they're working on focus as an example, or attention. I'm like, okay, let's push. Let's like really intensely do that. So, moving the thresholds so that they're getting feedback when they're in the highest intensity of focus. Then I'm like, okay, now shut the feedback off. I want you to completely not do that, to shift back to this micro state of recovery, calm, letting all the thought processes go. Because if you think about sport, performance, being a student taking a math test, in this moment of in between questions, wherever we are, we need those. I need to engage, I need to back off, recover, rest, recompose, flush all the stuff that was going on before, and then re-enter. That's kind of what we're trying to illustrate. So you can absolutely create that just by practicing it, literally. Like, turn it on. Okay, now turn it off. I'll turn it on. Let's turn it off, and just back and forth.
And when it comes to like training the brains of peak performers, what's your approach in terms of working to make sure that you're not kind of minimizing, the aspects of their brain function that may be contributing to their, unique abilities or gifts, and instead enhancing those?
Yeah, it's a great question. And that's of the questions that athletes usually ask. It's usually the first one is, does it work? Is it effective? And if you say yes, and even if you said maybe, lots of individuals who are high performers are willing to give it a try just to see what happens. But that's the second most common question is, will this somehow take away my talent or my gift or whatever has gotten me to this point? And so it's a really critical piece, because we're not actually wanting whatever their brain is currently doing. We're good with it. We just accept that is an okay place to be. And what we want to do is create states that are different, but are alternates to that particular state that they're generally showing up with, like in that trait characteristic. So we're saying, that's great, let's do that. I'm not trying to change or remove or make more or less of anything while you're in that resting state. I'm actually wanting you to perhaps even push that farther, meaning make it more. intense, but then let's also contrast it against other states. And so this is where it really differs from a clinical presentation or a goal for a clinical client, is that now we're not saying, how does this finding correlate with the symptom, and now let's remediate it or make it go away. We're saying, how does this pattern show up in the way of enhancing performance? Let's keep it. Let's make it bigger, even if it's deviant. So like the idea of of normal and deviant and all those kinds of things in this world kind of goes out the window. Like it's relevant to have that question and go, how do they compare to healthy individuals or a reference population? That's a reasonable question to ask, but it shouldn't be what dictates the intervention. We're in a clinical population that has more relevance.
Right, right. I'm not sure if you're referring to like Z-score training specifically, but I mean that, when I think of like oftentimes what we're doing with kind of clinical neurofeedback is like training to the Z-score, kind of a normative database, kind of getting abnormal individuals back into the normal range. Whereas obviously with peak performance, they already are abnormal in a sense, but in a good way, right?
Right, potentially. That's exactly it. So yeah, whether that's from the decision making of making that comparison to a reference population, just saying, okay, you have too much or too little of something, or if it literally means train from the neurofeedback standpoint of the feedback being based off of getting it closer to a 0 standard deviation value. So it doesn't matter what the metric is that you're actually training. It's the mentality of going in of saying, how do I decide what to train? We're not just addressing the deviant patterns. In fact, we're saying that deviant pattern might be a contribution to some ill experience that the person's having. So if they're over aroused and they've got too much fast frequency activity, and then they're always experiencing this over arousal, I mean, you might address that, and it is deviant. But just because it's deviant doesn't mean it's a problem. Yeah.
And is it going, do you think that like having like say a peak performance database is a realistic thing, like in the sense of like if we could put together sort of a peak performance database to train individuals to kind of the brain states of peak performers, or is there too much variation in kind of the brain states of peak performers where that isn't possible?
Yeah, so I think both are possible, but it's kind of like a two-tiered thing. So yes, I think it's valuable. So when I was working just at one period, working in the entrepreneurial space, we were collecting just tons of peak performer data and ended up with over 1,300 elite performers. They were either Fortune 50, Fortune 100 company executives, or people who were at the top of their game in world-class athletes, Olympians, professionals, et cetera. And so like maybe some also, there was some military types of applications in there, but people who were objectively identified as people who are peak performers or high performing individuals. And so as a collective group, there was value in being able to take another individual and compare them to that group and say, here's how you compare to other elite performers. But it didn't, if we said, okay, here's that mean value of whatever the EEG metric is, taking that individual and making them match that mean, I don't think is a good strategy, because what's really important is that every individual will approach a different, approach the same environment in a different way. And so what helps you succeed in a high pressure setting under, like at the highest level, may not be the exact same way that I should approach it. And making my brain electrically match what you or the collective looks like doesn't make a lot of sense either. Again, we're training to that regression towards the mean. And then what? Then we just have a group of similar functioning individuals who are all performing at some, in some way. So so I think there is value in understanding what is a range, how does that group look compared to an individual. But then ultimately, I think that's kind of where it stops. It's a good data point, but again, not the thing that would dictate what would be good for any given individual.
Got it. Okay. And now in terms of like, when I introduced you, I talked about the, that you've been that you've led research partnerships with Red Bull North America's High Performance Center, USA Track and Field, US military. Out of all of when you think about all of the research collaborations that you've been a part of, are there any specific ones that really stand out to you in your mind?
They all have some uniqueness to them. The military types of things were a little bit more basic science of like exploratory. Can we identify certain characteristics that might um, cause us to find an individual to be particularly talented in a particular way, or identify early markers of needing an intervention or being particularly good for a particular thing. So it was just really exploratory. It was valuable. It's good information. And then with all of the athlete populations, they all had something. I think the collaboration with Red Bull is probably the one that was most influential because there were such a wide variety of individuals. I mean, you had people doing all sorts of a variety of action sport kinds of things, extreme, stunts, events, down to even some team play. So I think from a broad spectrum of awareness, that was and they also had a really diverse group of individuals who were all collaborating at the same time. So we'd have sports psychology, neuro, nutrition, biomechanics, like the whole gamut of individuals. So that was really interesting to be able to see, how does this fit within the context of a broader sports science program or a high performance program, which is now kind of the trending phraseology for that type of thing. So I think that would probably stand that collaboration. And it was also the longest collaboration. It wasn't just like, we're going to go do this project and get this data. We're going to like really just offer it to athletes, both data collection, let's answer some specific questions, but let's also offer this as a service to our athletes that were being sponsored as, just an awareness, like educational opportunity of seeing how their brain works, but also if they wanted to do training, then they could engage in that. So I think, yeah, that would probably be the one. There's not a specific finding that stands out from that group outside of how diverse. I think that's probably the takeaway messages. And that helped me answer the question you just asked before this one of, do we want like an elite performing, stereotypical kind of idea that we want to train to? And that group clearly demonstrated and taught us the lesson that no, that's not the way it would work. You could pluck any of those guys from any of their given, crafts, give them the physical skills and body or whatever it takes to be successful, but their brains would then succeed in a different way than the person that we had, kind of dropped them in. So you just can't make two of the same people work in the same way. So.
And then, so you were talking about, as far as the interventions, you guys were doing neurofeedback with those Red Bull individuals.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that was one of the options. They had access to so many different things, but that was one of the offerings that they had. Some athletes really engaged to a high degree. Some, in the high performing population, and this is true in the business world as well, and the performing arts as much as it is in sports, but it's more clearly seen in the sport world. Is there's so many opportunities for things that are both technology and traditional training methods. Like there's always something to be doing. And so they have to be really careful about what's going to be the maximum return on my investment from a time standpoint. And so that was, some individuals, had the opportunity, or they felt like this was the modality that offered them the most opportunity for improvement. And so they really engaged to a high degree, and other individuals engaged to a lesser degree, depending on what else they had going on in their world.
And in terms of like, answering that question now, as far as like the different kind of neuromodulation or biofeedback technologies that do offer kind of the most return on someone's investment of time and money, other
Mm-hmm.
resources, like what sort of things stand out to you besides just neurofeedback?
In the physiological world, like biofeedback types of things.
Yeah, or like, I don't know if
Okay.
you pay attention like photobiomodulation or
Uh-huh.
stimulation,
Uh-huh.
any of those
Yeah.
other.
Yeah. So all of those things I think are can be valuable. The thing that I always stress, and I think this is kind of foundational, and I think probably, hopefully, most all other sports psychologists or other individuals in that performing world would say that the easiest low-hanging fruit is respiration and heart rate variability training. These are things that anybody can do. You don't have to do them for a very long time. I mean, doing 3 to 5 minutes, let's call it twice a day, can be profoundly impactful. The equipment is, $100-ish, give or take, depending on how fancy or elaborate you want the equipment to be. Can travel with it. You can do all sorts of things. So that, I think, is really low hanging fruit because it's so low on the investment side, and time and money. Um, the other things that the stimulation techniques then become appealing because most of the investment is on the buying the device side of the house, where you can be, answering emails, or studying playbooks, or doing watching TV, even like having downtime while doing a neurostimulation type of a procedure. And so that's pretty low hanging fruit also on the time investment, which is the most valuable commodity in those populations. So I think that has some real value. The challenge with the stimulation technologies is that they are effective. They do provide benefit, but there is some degree of ongoing, I'll call it maintenance for lack of a better expression, but there's ongoing use in order to keep the benefits at the highest level. And there's some situations where that definitely matters. So if I'm going through a particular challenge and I use a stimulation technique to help me figure it out, I may not need as much as if I have an ongoing, more chronic kind of a situation. So there's nuances in there, but generally speaking, it is a recurring process. But again, the investment on the time is lower just because I can do other things at the same time. The most powerful, obviously, are the operant conditioning types of things, the biofeedback and neurofeedback, even photobiomodulation. That's also fits in that same category of there is a learned response that's happening along with the stimulation response in some of the devices. So I would say generally easiest low-hanging fruit are the very simple biofeedback, respiration, heart rate variability. Then the stimulation techniques have some value with more investment. And then the biggest investment is the one that has the biggest return, which are the operant conditioning modalities.
And you found that like the results from, say, doing neurofeedback, biofeedback, you found to be like more kind of enduring or long lasting than, say, the neurostimulation?
Right, exactly. So well, if you get to a certain threshold, so like for me, I say, if somebody wants to invest 5 sessions of time together, it can be good for educational purposes of them saying, oh, I thought that's what focus felt like, but I can see now how my brain is contributing to that experience. Or even doing an evaluation in a single meeting can be really profoundly impactful in understanding how that person's brain contributes to their experience. So it takes a lot of the I'm crazy, or all the squishy part of psychology. It eliminates that for a lot of people. They go, oh, that's just how my brain works. So let me figure out other strategies to do that thing without, to fit my brain. So even from just a educational standpoint, that's great. But if they want to do the training to make a significant change, then for me in neuro specifically, it's like, let's get to 20 sessions. Those first handful of sessions are just about observation. You're figuring it out. The next handful of sessions are really learning and gaining some control. And then when we get to like around session 12-ish, individuals generally say, I feel like I'm controlling the feedback. Like I can identify. They may not be able to have the right words or be really articulate about it, but they definitely feel in control of manipulating the system and are starting to see benefits in concrete external ways. But then we need to like reinforce that. I mean, it's the same as, we're learning a language or an instrument or anything else. Like once you learn to play a song on your guitar, if you put it away and you don't practice it enough, then it fades. And so like all other things that we learn, there is kind of a minimum. And for me, that number is around 20-ish sessions of the training. And then we see some long lasting effects.
And in terms of like your approach to training, like, I've interviewed plenty of neurofeedback experts on the podcast, and everyone has kind of a different approach. There's so many different systems, methods of training out there, and I feel like a lot of kind of division, within the field of one group saying this training is the right thing to do, another group kind of refuting that. What is your approach when it comes to neurofeedback training?
So I think that all of those approaches have value. It's about knowing when that approach has the most value for the particular client. And so, just like if we were to use, other mental health types of things, you wouldn't say that, any given theory or modality, let's use cognitive behavior therapy as an example. That's a very popular one. Lots of people know it may be the right answer for some individuals' presentation. It's going to be not the best choice for somebody else. It doesn't mean it's ineffective. It just means it's not the best choice for this situation. So I think having an awareness of what are all the range of options, and then let me apply the metric which best correlates with the presentation or the goal that I'm trying to achieve in the client. So that would be the first piece. So I think a lot of the division is superficial or even artificial. It's like it's what I know and it works, and therefore that's the one that I believe in, and the others maybe not. So so I think that's a trap that we fall into that we shouldn't. But then in my personal philosophy is that the most simple feedback, the most simple way that the individual can learn is going to be one, the fastest way to learn, but also the longest lasting. And what I mean specifically is, the technology now, and meaning software and analytics, and you can do all sorts of things. I could make a really complicated algorithm asking 32 different electrodes attached to my scalp to get reinforced when they do, an infinite number of possibilities of different things. The challenge with that, the brain will learn. So, I mean, not that anybody would make one that complicated, but let's just say even they were using, lots of electrode sites and asking different sites to do different things in the EEG metrics. The brain would learn what to do, and it can be effective, but the client doesn't have the same level of insight as to what they did to get there as they do when they have used a more simple approach, from my experience anyway, and that's particularly in performance applications. So really important for me and the clients that I work with is that they don't just show up and we do something, they participate, and then they feel better or they perform better. Like that's great. I mean, it's hard to argue with that being an outcome, but better is that they come in, they know what they did in order to create that success. So now when they're, in the bottom of the ninth of a World Series or the fourth quarter and inches to go, they can tap into it. So it's less about, let's just teach your brain to do something that you have no awareness of. Let's teach you how to generate that thing. And then when the stakes are high, you say, okay, when I was doing that thing, and I'll use an example, there was a boxer that we worked with, a heavyweight champion, and he's just a giant guy, and he would usually, a match would end very early, and not a high number of rounds. So there was a situation, his opponent got sick, but it was already set up, and so they had another boxer come in. It was somebody that he had sparred with before as a training partner, and so they knew each other. And this went on so the rounds were many, and the match went on for a long time. And so at one point, he reported back that, I can't remember the specifics, it was the seventh or eighth round or whatever, but they're going at it. And he's thinking to himself, just drive that car, drive the car, drive the car. He was literally trying to create the same internal environment that had been successful for him in the neurofeedback session, in that boxing match, in that moment, because he knew whatever he was doing, we had been working on endurance from an attention standpoint, and he was fatigued, he was getting tired. And so he was really tapping into what was successful for him in those sessions. If we just hooked him up and said, make the screenplay or whatever the feedback was, but it was a really complicated algorithm, he wouldn't have had that insight into how do I tap into it. So my approach is, what's the most simple way we can get to them understanding what they're doing so that they can really generalize and take that learning out of the office and into the field.
Right. I was just going to say that exact same thing, being able to transfer what they're learning kind of while doing neurofeedback and then actually apply that into the kind of real world applications.
Exactly.
Now, how about when it comes to sort of lifestyle interventions or just, things when it comes to, how much people are sleeping or eating, exercising, like how have you found that impact both, I guess, the EEG, the electrical activity of people's brains, along with, kind of just high performance?
right? So it's critical to both. It's less specific, so I can't say that if you are malnourished, you're going to have the EEG will respond in this very specific way. It will be different. We see that when people have either they're hypoglycemic or they've taken, let's say, too much of an energy drink or whatever, like our brain does that, there is an electrical reaction to the things that we put into our body, although that might be either non-specific or more subtle than we would notice traditionally. Like I won't know if you had fast food or if you had really great uh, organic homegrown vegetables last night. It's not going to change your brainwave over a period of time. There of course would be implications in a non-specific way. But all of those things, particularly sleep and nutrition, I mean, there's a huge, you could do a whole set of series of interviews with people on gut brain, connection and how that works, which is not my domain expertise. So I won't pretend to get into it, but there's a massive way in which what we put into our body affects that. But then the sleep is critical. That's one of the, it was always, whenever we're talking to a high performing group of individuals, that's one of their primary interests. How is this going to impact my sleep? Will it make me sleep better? Almost sometimes they're more concerned about that than will I score more points or get more deals or whatever their thing is. And so all of those things, nutrition, sleep habits, exercise routines, everything that you think about from like being a healthy individual contributes to increased performance. And so it's really straightforward. If we could use lots of different metaphors for it, but if we don't have a properly tuned body or a housing for our brain and the appropriate fuel for it, and that can include the environmental context, and that doesn't just mean like, am I physically fit and am I eating right and all those kinds of things, but do I have the right balance in my life, work-life balance? Do I have recreation? Do I have a support system, friends, family, all those kinds of things? The emotional support goes into that mix too. And so we're ultimately, if we want to have the maximum performance, we should be looking at all of those things. They're all critical. It's not that one is more or less important than another. And I think that's where some of the challenges become, as I mentioned before, is like we have a finite amount of time, and like any one of us could spend 6 hours a day easily just doing self-care. I'd love to go to a yoga class and then go work out and then do some sleep and recreate and read something entertaining but stimulating, and like we just don't have that chance. And then when you factor in what an athlete's doing for their physical conditioning, which tends to take the priority because that's what we can see, and that's a disadvantage for some folks, is like we need to look at all of those things to answer your question. They're all critical, but there's not a magic recipe, and even that recipe will vary, both the ingredients and how much, for each individual. So you really have to work with a collaborative team to say what fits for this person and the goals that they have.
Got it. Well, Dr. Sherlin, we're coming up onto the end of the show. Really have enjoyed this fascinating discussion with you. The last thing I wanted to ask you, in terms of kind of looking to the future of kind of peak performance training, brain training, what excites you the most, or where do you sort of see this going?
It's funny. I've for the past few weeks, I've got to engage with several people in like interviews and things like that. And so that's always the last question. It's always probably one of the harder questions because 20 years ago, I would have said that I think neurofeedback and biofeedback, just like the awareness of using these technologies, is going to like open up everything. It's going to be wide open. Everybody's going to be excited. It's the final frontier of performance, all those kinds of things. That didn't happen in those 10 years. And then I was like, okay, well, the next 10 years, it'll be like breaking down the barriers of technology and like access to equipment and services and things like that. And there's more providers and there's more wearables and all sorts of, cool toys and things that do really good work. And that hasn't shifted it drastically. So to be fair, I think that it comes down to a couple of things. One, us being really providers, people who have the awareness and knowledge of these tools, is to really advocate the proper positioning of the tool in the overall plan and picture. There's definitely opportunities for more research, so we can be very specific on, in this client who has this type of presentation, doing X, whatever X equals for training is going to yield some particular outcome, and plus or minus a little bit. It can't be, guarantees, of course, but then the challenge right now is the clients can't make as good a decision about what's my investment and what's that return going to look like. And so that causes a little bit of challenge for some folks to be like, yeah, I'm all in, especially when they're on limited things. Technology is expanding and growing, and that's great, but the barriers sometimes are still too high to get in, whether it's cost or ease of use or where it's available, how it's available, traveling, all that kind of stuff. So I think all of the things that we have been doing as a field, technology, research, awareness, education, those things, but more. We're going to have to really double down on those things and get in front of people so that they can find the benefits. And unfortunately, if we think about healthy people and clinical populations, sometimes we don't do things until it hurts. So, like we all know that spending 30 minutes to an hour walking, running, cardiovascular is going to be good for us in the long term. We all know that eating good nutrition is going to be long term good for our health. We'll perform better, but we don't always do it. We wait until I'm not performing well or something hurts, and then we start to address it. And so we've got to really shift. I think the bigger thing in general is that we shift our mindset about how do we take care of ourselves to perform better before we have problems.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Sherlin, if people want to find out more about your clinical practice or research or connect with you, where would you direct them to?
Yeah, easiest place is to go to my website, which is just drsherlin.com. And my email is leslie@drsherlin.com. So they can reach out in those ways. Of course, I've got the social media stuff, but in my world, I try to limit those things and connect with people in real life. So, but there's some things out there in that domain too.
I hear you. Awesome. Well, I will link those in the show notes. And for those listeners who enjoyed the show, go ahead and like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Roscoe's Wetsuit Neuro. And also you can go ahead and listen to the podcast on whatever audio platform you listen to podcasts on, whether that be Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any of the others. We are on them all. Dr. Sherlin, I wanted to again really thank you for coming on the show today to share all of your knowledge and expertise.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely.
Wasting my time.
You just can't help yourself, can you?